Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemuller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. On today's episode, I'm going to do a recap on countries that I've been in since the last time I've done an update. So I started out, if you want to go back, listen to a previous episode where I talked about my travels through, I believe it was 8 days through the UK. Now, this episode is going to highlight my travels in the Netherlands, Denmark. Now, before I get started on my trip to the Netherlands, I just want to say a big thank you to Karsten Snip, who was one of my hosts in the Netherlands. Him and his wife were very gracious to host me for several days. And he also helped line up a lot of the visits that I had as well. So again, thank you, Karsten, for your support of my Nuffield travels.
Hey everyone, before we get started with today's episode, I just wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Bank Barn. I love these guys and what they're doing to streamline banking and agriculture. They're helping to connect farmers and lenders so that today's farmers have more options no matter the size of operation. Check out bankbarn.io to learn more.
Now, I started out with a trip to the Lely headquarters in Maassluis, and I had been there before. Back in 2016, I had met Alexander van der Lely, who was then CEO of Lely. He has since retired from that role and is doing several other things, but I had the chance to meet up with a couple of the engineers working in artificial intelligence at Lely. One of them works mostly on the technical support side, and the other one is working more on the robot milking side of things. So it was really interesting to hear how Lely is utilizing artificial intelligence, gathering a lot of different data, even on the robot end, to help technicians that are Lely technicians to fix robots better and have less downtime on robots and be able to train their technicians more effectively. So that was a use of AI that, of course, seems obvious once you hear it, but one thing that I hadn't really thought about up until that point in time. We got to look at a few different things that Lely has in their product lineup that aren't very familiar with me in the U.S. That was interesting to see their bottling system that they have developed, as well as a self-propelled robotic feed harvester that can also put down manure as well as it's harvesting. And one thing that I was a little bummed about was, I believe it was the day that I was leaving the Netherlands, Lely had what was called their Yellow Revolution unveiling, which was several new items in their product lineup. They're very tight-lipped about those type of things, so I didn't hear about that until I was flying out. So I was a little bummed that I missed that, but that's okay. Maybe next time I can be able to see some of those things. So getting outside of my topic, I had the chance to go to a very large, well-known business in the Netherlands called Hendrik Willig Dairy, and they make cheese. They have cheese stores all over Europe, very, very popular in Europe, and they direct market a lot of their cheese, and they also export a lot to other countries as well, including the U.S., and that was interesting to go see their farm that they have at the location where they make a lot of their cheese. They have one farm that's kind of a demo farm. It's an operating working dairy that milks, I believe it was 120, 130 cows, and had a couple of robots there. And it was a very well laid out Dutch dairy. We got to see how they harvest red beets and process those for the fresh market. Was Scap Red Beet Farm in North Holland. And it was really interesting. This is the largest red beet grower in all of the Netherlands. Now, if anyone's been to the Netherlands, you know that there's a lot of high value crops that are grown there because land prices are really expensive. I'll come back to that in a minute. So some of the big high value crops they have are sugar beets, are red beets like this, carrots. Tulips is a really big one. That is very, very valuable crop. So you see a lot of these very high value crops, and also glass greenhouses that have really driven up land prices because they produce a lot of revenue per acre. So that's one way that they've seen land use changes, going from sheep and beef, then to dairy, then from dairy now to these very, very high valued crops, which is a challenge for those that are in the dairy industry in the Netherlands. They're very well known for having a lot of cows. So in the US, we have a little over 20,000 dairy farms. And in an area that's 1/6 the size of my home state, Michigan, so 1/6 the size, they have 14,000 dairy farms. Again, the US has a little over 20,000 dairy farms. So 60% of the entire US dairy farm number fit in an area 1/6 the size of Michigan. And by the way, there's 18 million people living there as well. So Michigan, I believe, has a population of, don't quote me on this, I think it's 9 to 10 million we're at right now. It's fluctuated a little bit, but a population double that of Michigan, 1/6 the size of Michigan, with 60% of the entire U.S. dairy farm numbers in that country. It was very impressive to see. They've been very productive over a long period of time, as well as exporting a lot of advancements in dairy technology around the world. They're very well known for that in the Netherlands. So I'll come back to, in a minute here, some other interesting things that I learned about the dairy industry in the Netherlands. But getting back on track to some of the visits, another visit that I had that same day that I was at the red beet farm was a visit to Amigo Plants. Now, Amigo Plants has, I believe it was 100 acres roughly under glass and outside in Kenya, Portugal, and the Netherlands. And they grow nothing but succulent plants. So think aloe vera, things hens and chicks, those type of plants like that. They ship all over Europe and even other parts of the world as well. It was very impressive to see what they've done there, how they started with, I think it was 2 acres of greenhouses. And that was not that long ago. So they've expanded very rapidly. And it's interesting to hear their thoughts of the future and what they're planning on doing, not necessarily getting bigger, but just trying to get better. And as they step into a new generation that's taking over that business, it was very interesting to hear that perspective. So after that, I had a chance to visit a few different dairy farms. I was able to go see the Snips Dairy Farm in Groningen, as well as Advin Veldes, who is the president of Global Dairy Farmers Network. And it was great to see his place. We've stayed in touch for many years now, and it was great to be able to meet his family and had an interesting conversation with his son, Peter, who is studying biophysics in the U.S. for a PhD. We had an interesting conversation about how he utilizes artificial intelligence and what he's doing in biophysics. So I enjoyed that time, learned a few lessons from that I'll bring up later on in another episode about my findings on artificial intelligence. Now, one of the things that we don't have much of in the U.S. that I saw around a lot of different dairy farms in the Netherlands is what's called zero-grazing. Now, that's taking a wagon. Usually you have a mower on the front of the tractor, taking a wagon right behind that tractor, picking up that freshly mown grass or forage, whatever. Ended up most of the time in the Netherlands, it was grass. And taking that back directly to the barn and feeding that out right away. This is something I have seen in the U.S. Very few farms do that, but it's very typical in the Netherlands to go out and you do this, multiple times a day because it needs to be very fresh in order to make this work. So that was interesting. I have some pictures of those wagons and that setup on some of our social media platforms if you want to take a look at some of those posts to see what that looks like. Now, one thing that you notice about Dutch dairy farms as you travel around the Netherlands is they're very neat and tidy, which I appreciate. It really makes you proud of the industry, and I think it really gives the sector a good image if you can see from the road a very beautiful farm. So that's definitely one thing I appreciated about the Dutch dairy farms. So a couple of the other visits that I did in the Netherlands were for my topic of study, artificial intelligence in dairy. And one of those, of course, if I was in the Netherlands, I'd have to visit is NeedApp. If you're not in the dairy industry, you probably don't know NeedApp, but they're very well known. They're really focused on building hardware and gathering data and then partnering with other companies in the supply chain, other dairy equipment manufacturers to utilize that data downstream further. So they're very, very focused in what they do. And I really appreciated how open they were on the topic of artificial intelligence. Some companies are a little leery of talking much about it and what they're doing. So I really appreciated Roxy was the gentleman that I talked to there, very knowledgeable and very passionate about the subject of artificial intelligence and using it to drive dairy forward in the future. The one thing that Roxy said that NeedApp is very focused on is making the switch of the industry from management focused, management centric, which means setting things up so that people can manage things easier on the farm, to making things cow centric. Not making it harder for people to operate the farm, but really being able to utilize technology and data to give the cow the best possibility to be productive and comfortable. So my last visit that I had in the Netherlands was to Wageningen University, which is a very well-known university in agriculture around the world for developing new technology. And I had the chance to meet with Claudia Kamphuis there, who did a lot of different things in machine learning with genetics. So that was very interesting to talk to her on that aspect of machine learning and AI, as well as what's going on with vision technology for animal health. Another thing that we discussed is there's a lot of information and data gathering that scientists and researchers love to do. You know, a lot of that data that they're collecting might not necessarily be able to have an impactful outcome on the dairy farm. So really, as an industry, we have to focus on research and development for first being able to make impactful decisions on the farm. Otherwise, it's not really necessary to have all this technology to utilize and bring us data if we're not going to use it, right? So making impactful, actionable outcomes from the data that's being gathered is extremely important. Now, another thing that was brought up during our conversation was the 6 principles of animal welfare in the Netherlands. If you've heard of it before, you probably say, well, there's only 5 principles, right? No, there's 6. The 6th one was just added, and that was emotional health of the animal. So it's a very, very controversial topic, and we'll see what this changes in the industry and how widespread it goes. Is it just going to stay in Northern Europe, or is this going to spread around the world? We'll go deeper into this subject. I think if it becomes more of a topic in the U.S., I would like to have some more conversation about this. It is controversial, and it's something that I thought I'd bring up on this. If somebody's interested in having a discussion about it, reach out to me. I'd be interested in having that. While at Wageningen, I had the opportunity to meet Alphonse Beldman, who is the president of Nuffield, Netherlands. He's also a dairy economist with Wageningen University. So we talked a lot about just an overview of the dairy industry, some of the facts and figures that I wanted filled in from my travel through the week that I hadn't pieced together yet. So he was very helpful in piecing those things together and really talking about some of the challenges that are facing Dutch dairy farmers for the future. There's a lot of things right now going on with legislation and regulation around ammonia and the impact that that's going to have, where farms are going to need to destock potentially. Cost of getting rid of manure is going to get very high, and they're probably going to have to buy in more commercial fertilizer because they're not able to use the manure that they have to add nutrients to their ground. So this is a very, very sensitive subject in the Netherlands right now. As you can tell, there's probably farms that are going to go out of business, that are going to have to sell out because of it. So this is a very sensitive thing that I would like to stay on top of and see how it turns out. Now, another thing that we talked about is return on capital for Dutch dairy farms, they're really not looking for return on capital. If you do the math, the numbers, and what land costs there for dairy farming and what net profit is, there's not a lot of return on capital that they're experiencing with land values the way they are. So they're seeing land values that would equate to 30 to 40,000 US dollars per acre that they're dairy farming on. That just does not allow you to have a decent return on that capital. And if you look at the infrastructure of the sheds and equipment that's utilized, there's a lot of capital that's tied up. And the average dairy farm in the Netherlands is 140 cows. Now, remember, I said there's 14,000 cows. Excuse me. Remember, I said there's 14,000 dairies in this country, but the average size is only 140 cows. So there's not many that are above the 400 to 500 cow mark. I think the largest one in the entire country is a 2,000 cow dairy, and I believe there's only one of those. So there's not a lot of large scale dairies here. So it'll be interesting to see how the sector transforms and consolidates with not being able to have more than a few hundred cows on an individual site in most areas of the country. Now, one thing that I found interesting in both the Netherlands and Denmark is each country has its own national registration for cattle. So it keeps track of all of the information of that individual animal through its entire life on a national database. So everyone is on it. It's kind of unlike what we have in the US, where we have all these different operating systems that we're putting this information in. And some people are just keeping it written by hand yet in the US. So this was interesting to see what they were able to achieve because of it. And there was also some skepticism because now everything is known nationally and it's run nationally. So the potential for the wrong people to be in charge of it is also there. So that was a concern that some people had with the registration, but it definitely streamlined things and allowed everyone in the nation to utilize it and communicate with their advisors and things like that on a pretty effective way, as well as to get information to your processor or co-op that you're involved with, that you're shipping milk to, that's asking for different sustainability markers and KPIs on your farm. All right, so that was my trip to the Netherlands. Then I was on to Denmark. I was not in Denmark for very long, about 2.5 days. So I was able to see a few different dairy farms there, as well as meet with a large investment firm that's investing in farmland and timberland in Denmark, and as well as other areas of Europe. One of the farms that I was on in Denmark was Torben Sonderby's dairy farm, which is one of 4 Arla farms in the Arla network of innovation farms. So Arla is one of the biggest dairy processors, dairy co-ops in Europe. They operate in the UK, Denmark, Sweden, and a little bit into the Netherlands, and I think Germany as well. So they're in quite a few of the Northern European countries. Very large co-op. And Torben's farm is an organic dairy, and he has a lot of different technologies that we saw on there, including some technologies for methane measuring in his individual robot boxes, which was interesting. It was the first time I'd seen that. And again, this is where I was explained the national database that they have for Denmark on the cow information as well as the farm information. Now, even though Denmark is very close to the Netherlands, it is very different when it comes to farm structure and farm size. So we didn't see near as much grazing being done in Denmark. There's a lot more confinement systems like what you would see mostly in the US. And there are also quite a bit larger farms than what you saw in the Netherlands. Land prices were definitely cheaper, although they had risen quite a bit in the last 5 years. But there are several, it's pretty common to have a farm of 400 to 500 cows in Denmark, where in Holland, again, getting over 200 cows was not very typical. Now, another thing that I found very interesting in both Denmark and the Netherlands was the issue of getting rid of water. Now, a lot of you that are listening from dry areas of the US or Australia, areas where you're always trying to irrigate or capture water, this is probably a problem you wish you had, but it's a very real problem. As I was driving around, they were dealing with an abundance of water. You could see ruts in the field where they had rutted up even grass fields this summer because it was so wet. So their big problem is getting rid of water efficiently and effectively. I thought that was very interesting. Another thing that I found that was very interesting in Denmark was how expensive everything was. Europe, I thought, probably going to be more expensive than the US in terms of standard living costs, but Denmark just blew me away at how much, especially food costs to eat there. It was very, very expensive. Hotels were very expensive in comparison to even Sweden. And also, as I do in pretty much every country, I like to go to the grocery store when I'm in a new place. So I went to the grocery store not only in the Netherlands, but also in Denmark. And I noticed there was not a lot of dairy products when compared to what I'm used to in the US or even in the Netherlands. There was quite a large dairy section. The stores in Denmark had much smaller dairy sections, and especially the yogurt. That was interesting to see. They did not have a lot of choices of yogurt. There was a very small section, and most of it was skyr, which is a kind of Icelandic style yogurt, which is pretty common in Scandinavia. But that was really the only yogurt that I saw in some of the smaller grocery stores that I went in, at least. So very interesting to see how diets are different in different countries, even though they're very close to each other, very different cultures. It's really unique, something that you don't find when you're traveling across the U.S. as much. Whereas in Europe, you can go drive 2 or 3 hours and you're in an area that is a completely different culture from what you just came from. So it's something that I really enjoyed seeing as I've been touring around Europe. Now, one last note, something that I had heard a bit about as I was traveling through Northern Europe is a disease called blue tongue. And it's supposed to be spread by mosquitoes. So as you can imagine, I had mentioned earlier that Denmark and the Netherlands were always talking about how do they get rid of water. So what are mosquitoes growing? They lay their eggs around water sources. They've had a very difficult time, especially the sheep herds in these countries. The flocks that have gotten it of sheep had 90% mortality rates, which just blew me away. I couldn't imagine getting a disease and losing 90% of my herd. But in the dairy cattle, it had a very similar effect to what we saw in the U.S. This past spring and summer with the dairy strain or the cattle strain of bird flu that had been going around. Farms were taking a huge hit in milk production. The cows would also show signs of their hooves would start turning blue and cracking. So that would cause really bad lameness issues in cattle, as well as death on quite a number of farms. So it's very interesting to see how we have similar issues. It's a different disease than what we have in the U.S., but how much that's affected things on the farms, especially the ones that have gotten it. It's been very decimating to their profitability for the year, and also has really kept the milk production supply down and in check. That's what we've seen in the U.S. as well with bird flu. So these developments in the dairy industry are going to really have an impact probably for a while on milk production. As our dairy herd gains immunity to these around the world, it is going to have an impact on dairy production for a while. One more thing that kind of shocked me as I traveled through the Netherlands and even the UK and Denmark was the amount of tillage work that's still being done, deep plowing that's still being done in these countries for all of the sustainability initiatives that they have, that there hasn't been a bigger focus on no-till crops. And they have their reasons. There's definitely good reasons for them to be tilling in certain areas, in certain conditions that they have. But it is very interesting to see how much tillage is still going on in Europe compared to what we've seen in the U.S. with a big adoption of no-till and minimum till situations to help not only for sustainability reasons, but for cost reasons. The amount of equipment needed if you're going to do a lot of tillage, and the amount of fuel and tractors that you got to have, it really adds up. So if you can minimize that, it really can help with profitability per acre on the farm. All right, so that's my wrap up of the Netherlands and Denmark. Even though I'm in Sweden, I'm going to do Sweden and Ireland, which is my last country before I go home, on another wrap up. So be looking for that. And if you're interested in checking out some of the stories and pictures and videos that I took along the way, check out our social media pages, my personal social media pages on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or our AgCulture Podcast. So until next week, I'm Paul Windemuller, and this has been the AgCulture Podcast. Thanks for listening.